10 years before the Civil War, a small group of families bought a plot of land in the far reaches of West St. Louis County. These trailblazers had a vision that few others could see, and a church was born. Over the decades, the landscape around them shifted. America changed, and they bravely kept stepping forward, doing whatever it took to bring the wholeness of Jesus to their changing world. Fast forward 168 years to a local church that is thriving and a vision that's becoming a reality. Fast forward to a community who are still bringing together imperfect people in pursuit of a whole life through an approach that is faith-filled, trailblazing, thought-provoking, open-hearted, and in touch. As the landscape around us continues to shift, as our community changes, we are bravely stepping forward, doing whatever it takes to bring the wholeness of Jesus to our world, trusting in His promise to always walk with us, to be our guide, our strength, our protection, to be the lamp unto our feet and the light unto our path. In the same way that Abram and Sarai, Jacob, Simon, and Saul embraced a new name for their new season, in this moment, so do we.
You just heard it. Psalm 119 says, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. But it's not until John's gospel, those are ancient words, it's not until John's gospel that we find out who the word is, that the word doesn't refer first and foremost to any scriptures or ancient writings, but it refers to Jesus, the person of God who puts on flesh and dwells among us. He is the word that we're talking about. And it's also in that same gospel, John's gospel, Saint John's gospel, that we discover that Jesus is the true light who gives light to all mankind, the light that shines in the darkness, a light that's so powerful that no darkness can overcome it. This weekend, as we embrace a new name, as we become Pathfinder Church, a new identity, it is first and foremost a testimony to who Jesus is. I want you to know that He is the one who leaves the 99 to find the lost one, and he goes with love and gathers them and leads them back home. He is the one who illuminates the face of the Father so that we don't have to guess anymore about who our God is. Instead, we can look at the face of Jesus and we can know with certainty who our God is. Jesus is the one who journeys with us through the ups and downs of life, the twists and turns that we all have to deal with in our journeys, and He is the one who helps us find our way. This is first and foremost a testimony to Him. But it's also a reminder of who we are. It's a statement about our identity as a church. You see, we are called to be His body. We are called to reflect Jesus to our community in this time and in this space. We are called to be a beacon of hope, a beacon of light in a world that is increasingly dark and gloomy and cynical. And so this is a reminder of who we are called to be as we reflect Jesus to our part of the world. But there's one more layer to this. Pathfinder is also deeply personal. See, it's a reminder to us that we are all on a journey, and none of us have arrived. Instead, we're always pursuing, never arriving, striving to take hold of that for which Christ has taken hold of us. And so there's kind of this variation here where you just pull out the heart of that marker, that logo, and we remember that we're still on a journey, and our job is to keep taking steps, but we have the light of Christ illuminating each step that we take so that we are not journeying alone. See, we are all pathfinders trying to find our way. And so this new identity, it's a reminder to us of who Jesus is. It's a testimony to Him as the light of the world. It's a reminder of our mission and focus as a local church. And it is a very personal reminder to each of us that we have not arrived, but instead we are still taking steps with Christ at our side. I don't know about you, but I am so excited to help our community see more clearly who we are and what we do, and also more important, to help them see more clearly who Jesus is as today we become Pathfinder Church. Amen? Yeah. I've got to give a quick shout out though. All of this work has happened in-house, all of this design work. We've got great artists and designers who have been a part of this, and a great production team who have created this. And it's just so quality. We've had great outside consultants too, who have helped us along the way. I think some of them might be here. Amy, are you here? Maybe they're out there. They may be back there hiding. Yeah, she's hiding. So we have some great outside expertise who's helped us along the way that we could not be here without. But all of the work has happened in-house. We have some really gifted people who serve this church day after day with heart and soul. And this has been a labor of love, this project that they've poured themselves fully into. Kyle Westmoreland, Kelly Porter, I think you guys are back there. Are you guys back there in the shadows? Yeah, they're back there standing against the wall. They're a designer artists, and they've done all this work. It is an honor to have people who are so gifted, our production teams, Brendan and Ethan and Andrew, and just who are so gifted, and they love and believe in this church that they go deep to make things happen. Here's a variation behind me of what this looks like. I can't wait to see all this stuff on a hat or a t-shirt. I'm gonna have all of it. I'm gonna have a whole closet full. I think it's amazing stuff. So I've been wondering, in light of a moment like this, how do you respond? How do you mark a moment like this? For me, as I sit here today, and let me have a seat actually, as I sit here today, I'll tell you, I feel overwhelmed by this moment. And some of that just has to do with how long this journey has been. It has been a long journey. And it's been good, but there have been parts of it that have been really, really hard. There have been moments where I have been just so reluctant. If you know the book of Jonah, I've said to lots of people that this has been my Nineveh. Some place I didn't want to go, but I felt like God kept leading me there. And so today as I sit here, I think about the hard moments, I think about the scary moments, I think about the moments of doubt or the moments of conflict and just wanting God to provide a way out, frankly. And he kept encouraging me to move forward in trust. As I sit here today, I'm also overwhelmed for another reason. I'm overwhelmed at the fact that where most churches in America sit in paralysis, unwilling or afraid to move, to take a step forward, to change, to try new approaches, just to do something. We're increasingly in America, to wither and die fruitlessly is the norm. And not only is it the norm, but in most places that's applauded as faithfulness. That's just what's expected out of churches. It's overwhelming to me to be a part of a church who says, no way. Who back in October, with a resounding yes, said, you know what? Let's keep trying to help people understand who Jesus is. Let's keep working to help people more clearly see the love of God. And yet the world is changing, and maybe it's harder to do this than it used to be, but we can change. We can do hard things. Do you know how unique and special and rare that is? I'm overwhelmed and so grateful to be a part of a church like this. I'm overwhelmed by the heart and the planning and just the prayers that have gone into this by so many people. This is truly extraordinary. Finally, I sit here a little overwhelmed to think about what on earth I'm going to do with all the extra time I have now. Extra time, that doesn't exist, does it? Back to the question, how do you respond then to mark a moment like this? And a couple of months ago, actually, I believe God led me to a place that has been a great source of inspiration for me for what I'm about to say to you, but also for this whole weekend. It's an event recorded 2,500 years ago. It's recorded, but it's 2,500 years old. And it relates to the people of Israel, the Old Testament people of God, a moment in their history. And I'm going to look at it with you in a minute. It comes from Nehemiah, a book of the Bible that we don't study a lot, but Nehemiah, we're going to look there. But before I do, I just want to give you some context for what these words are all about. See, the nation of Israel, they were God's Old Testament people, and if you know their history, they had a lot of ups and downs. They had some seasons where they were just about wiped out. And one of those seasons was after a period of really, a long period of civil war where they were in conflict with each other. And they divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And then after that, they were kind of weakened, by internal fighting. Then these outside invaders came in, these powerful outside kingdoms. They came in and they started looting them, and places like Babylon and Persia and Assyria. And so between the years of 723 and 589, Israel had been sacked, and basically it ceased to exist by 589. Their cities were destroyed, their temple was destroyed, their leaders were carried off into exile, and their nation was in ruins. And I imagine in those days there was a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of lamenting and saying, why me? And a lot of wishing for the glory days, as is common. But after a little while, God began to stir in the hearts of some leaders. He started with Cyrus, the king of Persia. He wasn't even a God follower, but God stirred in him and gave him this vision of religious toleration. What if we just let people worship in the way that they wanted instead of forcing them to do that? And then there became a man of God named Zerubbabel, and then another by the name of Ezra, and then another by the name of Nehemiah. And these men said, enough of the hand-wringing, enough of the lamenting, enough of the wishing for the glory days. Let's take action. And so they went and they asked for permission to take some of the exiles who were living far from home back home, if you can even call it home, because the place had just been decimated. Jerusalem, the capital city, was in ruins. But once they get home, they begin work first on the temple. They wanted to rebuild the temple of God, the place where they could worship. And it was hard, and they didn't have a lot of resources, and they didn't have a lot of people, but they rebuild the temple. And they get to this moment where they dedicate the temple, and it's a powerful moment of celebration. And the people are gathered for the dedication of the temple, and it's also such a human moment, because in that day, there were people who were seeing this, and they're crying tears of joy. They cannot believe their eyes that Israel is able to worship in their homeland again. And they've got a temple where they can worship their God, and they're overwhelmed with joy, and they're crying. And then it says that there were some in their midst who were crying, but they were crying for another reason. They were crying because they remember the old temple and they liked it better. And so there are people crying tears of joy, people who are crying tears of grief, and they're all crying together. And that's what it's like to be a part of a body. And so they complete the temple, and that's good. And then they set to work on rebuilding the walls of the city. And this is important, and I know to talk about building walls this day is kind of dangerous, right? Controversial. But to rebuild your city walls, that was important. You could not survive as a city without walls. You would be looted every hour of the night. You could never move forward. And so they have to start rebuilding their walls. And man, it was a leadership task. It was hard for them. They were under-resourced, and their morale was low. And there were all these outsiders who didn't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. But eventually, with the help of God, they do it. And they rebuild their walls, and they have gates, and they're protected and safe. And they know they have to mark this moment. They have to just pause and acknowledge what God has done in their midst. And the way they do it is so fascinating to me. They have a worship service, which maybe isn't fascinating. They have a worship service, but in the worship service, the centerpiece of it is a long prayer of remembrance, where the priests or the Levites, they begin to lead the people in these prayers, and they're telling God what God has done. It's kind of weird. They tell God what God has done throughout their history. And so they go way, way back. They go back to this guy, Abram, who was called to be the father of their nation. His name was changed to Abraham to mark his new season. And then they go back to Moses, this rescuer who took people from slavery in Egypt and led them out to freedom. And then they remember, and they remind God and also remind themselves of this chapter where God himself was the leader of the Israelites as they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, lost, trying to find their way, just wandering in the wilderness, and God was their leader. And today, that's where I want to zoom in. It's Nehemiah chapter 9. I want to look at this moment in history. Now here's the thing. I'm giving you a lot on history today, and it's important, but it's about to get more confusing. So I'm talking about a moment that happened 2,500 years ago with these Israelites trying to rebuild their city. But in this moment, where this moment of theirs, where they're celebrating the walls being completed, as they worship, they're going to remember a moment in their past further back, about 800 years before, so about 3,300 years from where we sit. And so it's kind of like in those TV shows where you have a flashback within a flashback, or we're seeing history within history. We're looking back to a moment 2,500 years ago. They're looking back to a moment in their history. And all of this is really important. But if in the history you get a little lost, it's okay. It'll become clear to you later. So Nehemiah chapter 9, this is a part of this prayer of remembrance. They're remembering their ancestors and what they did in the wilderness. They said, but they, after being rescued, our ancestors, they became arrogant and stiff-necked, and they did not obey your commands, O God. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked, and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return back to Egypt to their slavery. Now, this is, again, so true of human nature, right? People often prefer to live in the hell they know rather than risk the discomfort of trying to find heaven. It's true, isn't it? And we see this all the time, that we will persist in the misery we say we hate rather than deal with the discomfort, the uncertainty that comes with change and growth. And so they're remembering this moment where their ancestors had been provided for by God. God had been leading them in the wilderness, and then they're like, you know what, forget this is too hard, let's go back. It's a very human moment, but look how God responds. It says, they say, but you, God, are a forgiving God. You're gracious and compassionate. You're slow to anger and abounding in love. Therefore, you did not desert them, even though they tried to desert you, even when they cast for themselves an image of a golden calf and said, hey, everybody, no, this is your God who brought you up out of Egypt. Try to steal God's credit. Or when they committed awful blasphemies. See, they're remembering that all throughout time, people will do what people do, that we are prone to forget and to become overwhelmed with fear. We want to turn back. We stiff-necked, it's kind of like an animal that's got a bridle in its mouth or reins, and you're trying to pull it this way and it's like not turning its head. That's who we are, that's what we do. But they're also remembering, more important, that while people do what people do, God does what God does. They say, but because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the wilderness. Instead, by day, the pillar of cloud, I'll talk about this in a second, did not fail to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine on the way they were to take. You gave your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and you gave them water for their thirst. Even in the desert, springs of water God miraculously provided. For 40 years, you sustained them in the wilderness. They lacked nothing, even though they were living in the wilderness. Their clothes did not wear out, and nor did their feet become swollen. So again, 2,500 years ago, in this half-built city of Jerusalem, these God followers, they take time to remember what happened 800 years before out in the wilderness. And the reason they choose not just to look around at what God had done in their recent history, the reason they look all the way back to these ancient events is because they seem to understand that in those events there were some truths that were so important for the moment they sat on that day. See, church, I submit that in these ancient words, in this history within a history, there are some truths that are so important. They're deeply significant for where we sit today. And I just quickly want to highlight them for you. The first is here, these are the words of Nehemiah that we just looked at from Nehemiah. The first truth is that God is our guide. See, they remembered a time way back in the wilderness where God literally led his people around. He was a pillar of cloud or smoke by day. So for all of you who don't like the smoke or the haze in worship, I'm sorry, it's biblical. That's how God led them. And then at night, God became a pillar of fire. In the middle of the wilderness, he was this light that showed them the way and also provided protection for them. It was an extraordinary time where God literally was guiding them. And they knew it was important to remember that God is and always has been and always will be their guide. Now I ask you today, has God been our guide? Absolutely, yes. I think about our history, 168 years of history here. Started 10 years before the Civil War. This church was born when America was only 75 years old. Isn't that wild? And I think about all the change and the turmoil and the innovation and the transformation this soil has seen. I think about in the late 1800s when somehow someone had the idea not only to move here to this more main road on Manchester Road, but then this church bought an adjacent 20 acres of land. They had an acre, they bought an adjacent 20 acres of land. I have no idea what they were planning for that 20 acres of land back in the late 1800s. Churches just didn't do that kind of stuff. But as we look back at it now, we say, hey, they must have just been following the guidance of God. He was guiding them because he knew someday it would be important. Or I think about the decision to start services in English. This church was a German-speaking group of families. And at one point, they felt led to say, you know what? We shouldn't just be speaking God's word to other people who speak German. Let's speak it to our community and all these English speakers. Again, the guidance of God. Or I think in 1942, when this church decided to stop doing German services because no one was speaking German except a few people. And I'll tell you what, I would hate to be that pastor who had that idea. Or the 1950s, when the sanctuary that we were in at the time was unsafe, it was condemned, and we didn't have another place to worship, but God led us literally to worship in a fellowship hall for 3 years until he provided another way for us. Or I think in our more recent history, I think 30 years ago, how God guided the leadership at the time, the Congregational Assembly, to extend a call to a maverick, crazy, innovative pastor like few churches have ever seen, a man by the name of Stephen Hauer. And I think about how God led Steve and Carol and all the leaders who served along with them to execute a very different vision for a church that has become the reality of who we are today. And I just think, how did those people back in 1988, how did they know? And I don't know if they knew, if they saw. I think they were just following the guidance of God. God has been our guide. You know that? I mean, how else do you explain that we are one of the oldest churches in our region, and yet we're one of the fastest growing churches in America? Those two things don't ever happen together, only God. And to be sure, just like forever in history, just because God's leading doesn't mean that people have to follow. And so just like with us, as we think back to times past, there were lots of people who said, you know what, I'm getting off this crazy train. I don't know where this is going. And that's just what happens, right? I mean, the Israelites in the wilderness, they said, let's go back to Egypt. Let's live in slavery. It was better. Or on Nehemiah's day, when they're rebuilding the city, I'm sure they looked around and they said, where's everybody else? Because a bunch of people stayed back in Babylon, or they settled somewhere else that was different. And you know, that's just how it goes. But God has been our guide through it all. And I want to ask you today, do we still believe this is true? Do we still believe that God is our guide, that when we are lost, he's right there with us, helping us find our way because he knows the way. He is the way and the truth and the life. And isn't that what we want everybody to know? That a relationship with Jesus, it's not about rules and regulations. It's not about authority and control. It's not about taking us captive or making us prisoners. It's about setting us free. And then in our freedom, helping us find our way to the things that we long for most, life and wholeness. Isn't that what we want people to know still today? See, it's so important that we remember that God is our guide. The second thing that we can remember through all of this history is that God has given his spirit to instruct us, that God is our teacher. Now, these Israelites way back in the wilderness, they didn't have schools. They were illiterate. They were not educated. They had lived their whole lives as slaves. They didn't have much teaching. And yet, by the Spirit of God, God began to just instruct them about life. He gave them wisdom. He also began to teach them about who he was. And then, fast forward to those Israelites in Jerusalem. They had teaching, they had learning, they were a cultured people. And yet it was important for them to remember that ultimate wisdom doesn't come from books, it comes from the Lord. You know, this is so important for us. It's important for me, even as your pastor, to remember that the task here isn't just to learn the Bible or learn chapters or verses. The real task is to learn the character of God. The real task is to learn how to listen to the Spirit of God, how to seek our wisdom from God himself, because a day could be coming, and I'm not doom and gloom, I'm not expecting it, but a day could be coming when there are no pastors for you to access, and where we don't have Bibles to read, where they take them and they burn them and they scatter us to the corners of the globe, and our worship and our culture is decimated. But you know what, even if that happens, because it happened in history, even if that happens, we still have the Spirit of God to instruct us. It's so important that we remember that today. Because I can't sit here today and tell you what the future holds. We face a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty. But here's what we see if we look at God's movement throughout history: that God gives his Spirit to his people, and that Spirit gives people wisdom. The wisdom that they lack for life, for understanding. He gives them wisdom, the wisdom that they need as they face the unknown. Again, these people remembering this in Nehemiah, they're half-built city, they don't know where it's gonna go, but they know that God is the teacher, the one who gives wisdom. Third and finally, they remembered that day how God had sustained or provided for their ancestors in the wilderness. How he had provided manna, this bread from heaven. He provided quail, he provided water, he provided everything they needed. Not only did God provide what they needed, but he also protected that which he gave him, so their clothes didn't wear out and their bodies remained strong. A friend of mine used to remind me that wealth is not what is earned, it's what is kept. Some of you need to write that down. Wealth is not what is earned, it's what's kept, right? We all know people who earn a lot of money and they're not wealthy. We know people who don't earn a lot of money and because they're smart with it, they preserve a lot of it. And so it's not just about God provide for me, give, but part of God's provision is protecting that which he's given us to make it last. And again, those Israelites in Jerusalem, remembering what God did in the wilderness, this is so important for them because they're looking at this half-built city and they know they don't have the resources to pull this off. They don't have the workforce to pull this off. They don't have anything, but instead of bowing to scarcity and fear, worry, and hoarding, they know they need to remember that God never fails to provide. He never fails to sustain his people. Have you seen the provision of God in your life? I sure hope you have. In fact, you've seen it, whether you've realized it or not. Has God ever given you a job when you needed one, or a better job when you needed one, given you a promotion? Have you ever found an unexpected check in your mailbox, or some money came your way, or you got a favorable decision somewhere that you weren't expecting and suddenly you were better off than you planned to be, and it was at a time you really needed it? Have you ever had God just drop something in your lap that you were in need of, or just wanting in a unhealthy way? There's a story one time where God gave us this amazing piano when we needed it. We couldn't afford one. And it was just such a God story. He just dropped one on us, and it was something only God could have done, and it was so beautiful. Or on the other side, maybe some of you are driving a car with 200,000 miles and it's being held together by duct tape, but God must be blessing that duct tape because it's holding. Just because you know right now it's not a good season for you to buy a new car, and God is just, he's protecting what you have. Or I'd even say, maybe you've got some clothes that God has kept from wearing out, but I think worn out clothes are actually cool. But I can't say for sure because I'm over 40, so I don't know these things anymore. But thankfully, God has given me teenage daughters who tell me all the time, Dad, you can't wear that. So I kind of know that now. Have you experienced the provision of God? You have. It's important for us to remember that. Most of all, do you understand what God did when he provided the world Jesus, when he provided Jesus for you? So he wasn't just providing a way to heaven someday, a ticket to heaven. That's true and that's good. But do you realize that in Jesus, God was providing you freedom from imprisonment, freedom from shame, freedom from loneliness, that God was providing one who would walk with you, who would be your companion, who would bring you out of loneliness? Do you know that in Jesus, God was giving you someone who would help you find your way out of the status quo ways of living where we are just a people who are like lemmings running off a cliff, and yet God provided us another way to live, an example of another way to live. Do you realize that in Jesus, God was giving you hope and identity and love in everything you desire most deeply, wholeness and life? And as a local church for 168 years, has God provided for us? Has he sustained us? Oh my goodness, yes, the stories. But I can even testify over the last 10 years since I've been a part of this church's story, I've seen the provision of God, going back to the global economic meltdown that happened right as I was getting here, and then all the cultural shift. We've seen greater cultural changes in attitudes towards faith as America culturally becomes less Christian than we've ever seen in any other decade, I think. And not only that, but we've experienced worship changes and leadership changes and staff changes, and yet here we are, thriving. Why? Because our God provides. He always sustains his people. See, this is why it's so important for us to go back, and I know, again, it's confusing, but to go back and remember not just what God has done recently, but to go way back 168 years ago, 2,500 years ago, 3,200 years ago. Here's why: because there's power in your past. Now, most of us know this in the negative, that there's power in your past, because a lot of us experience being imprisoned by our past. Maybe it's something that we've done or something that's happened to us, something outside of our control, against our will, some tragedy, some hardship that we have had to experience. And yet so often what happens to us is, that came against our will, and yet we willingly decide to live in that trauma daily, on repeat, over and over again, or in that mistake, over and over and over again, on repeat. We know what it is to be imprisoned by our past, don't we? And sometimes it's not suffering, sometimes it's our glory. Some of us just want to relive the good days, when life was good and we just lived there, and what we don't realize is that we're actually living in prison. This is why old churches don't grow. Because they so often are caught up in when times were good, in the good old days, and they don't want to let go of those, and they live in their past, so they have no future. See, we know the negative sense of this, that there's power in our past, and we so often stay imprisoned there. But there's another power in our past, and that's the power of perspective. See, how do you respond to a moment like this? How do you mark a moment like this? With courage, the kind of courage that comes from having a clear perspective of who God is and what he's done. And just like those Israelites in Jerusalem when the city walls were being rebuilt, that's all we're doing, is we're remembering today the truth about who God is, that he is a God who guides us. He's a God who teaches us and gives us wisdom that we need for the unknown. He's a God who provides and sustains and protects that which we have. It's so important that we mark this moment by just remembering who God has been, not recently, but forever. And that we let that inform our perspective. Because just like those Israelites dealing with a half-built city of Jerusalem, the reason it's so important that we let this power of our past, the power of perspective, inform us is so that we can go forward in courage. Not knowing what tomorrow holds, but knowing that there's still a lot of work to do. And knowing that we don't labor for ourselves alone, but we labor because although we have not arrived yet, there are still so many people who are trying to find their way through life. And they think they have to do it alone. And they don't yet know that Jesus wants to come and walk with them through the twists and turns, through the ups and downs, through the heartache, through the joys. That he wants to walk in front of them clear the path, to broaden their way, that he wants to walk behind them, defending them as their rear guard. They're walking through life, they're trying to find their way, and they don't know they don't have to do it alone. And as long as that persists, then you know what's gonna happen? Our world is gonna go on hurting, living in hurt and hurting one another. That's why our work is not done. And so today, in this significant moment, we go forward with perspective and with courage to bring light and hope with a new name, but the same mission, a renewed sense of purpose to bring light and hope to help people find their way. Church, let's go. Father in heaven, thank you for being consistent in who you are, for being our guide when we're lost, for being our teacher, providing us wisdom that is inaccessible to us, for being our provider, the one who sustains. God, that's not just true of this local church, that's true of who you've been with your people forever. And so God, give us that clear perspective and give us the courage to follow you into the unknown as we seek to do your work, while we find our way ourselves, as we seek to help others find their way, for our good, for your glory, in Jesus' name, amen.
I'm overwhelmed by what we are a part of this weekend. I mean, as I think just about what we are embarking on and the incredible day that this is, looking at becoming Pathfinder Church, I can't help but to think of all those who have gone before us and the exciting ways that we are moving forward. And I think about how often do churches get to experience the adventure of following God like this? Definitely not often enough. And we've said it so many times this morning, but it's worth repeating. God has been so faithful to us. 168 years of him being faithful, and he's not done with us yet. Which means that we have an important role to play. We are called to be active participants in this bold next step. You see, we're not taking this next step to be cool or trendy. We are not. We are doing this to remove any obstacle that obscures who Jesus is and what he has for us. We're doing it so that many more can come into relationship with Jesus and understand the life that he offers. We're doing this so that many more can be brought together along with the rest of us imperfect people to pursue a whole life in Christ. So now it's about putting it into action. How do we do that? I think first it's about us sharing the hope that we have in Jesus with others. Maybe that's inviting a friend here on a weekend to experience a service, or maybe it's getting an online message and sharing that with a friend. Or maybe it's just about being very intentional in a relationship with someone. I think secondly, it's about us continuing to remain generous with our money and with our time, with our energy. God has not brought us this far for us to check out now. It's go time, which means we all need to be moving forward on our generosity journey. And then finally, it's about being prayerful. Fortunately, there are no limits to when or how much or where we pray. And actually this morning, we have created a prayer card for each of you. specifically for this day. So those of you who are on the end of the rows, if you would take the stack of prayer cards and kind of pass those inward. We're grateful for a lot of people being here today. You might have to pass over rows to get one, but we hope that each person can have one. Once you have a prayer card, I'd like to ask you to hold that. And for just a moment, I'm gonna ask you to close your eyes just in an attitude of prayer. I want you to be still. I want you to quiet your mind and consider what your prayer might be this morning. Maybe in this moment, God brings to mind a person, a friend, a coworker, a neighbor, a family member who's been struggling or who's been searching. And your prayer is going to center around that person. Or maybe it's a prayer of how you would love to see God move in this next chapter of Pathfinder Church. Maybe it's a prayer claiming a promise of God that has been encouraging to you, or a scripture that has been encouraging. Or maybe it's just a prayer of thanksgiving for how God has grown you, has brought wholeness to your life in this church. This is your opportunity right now to respond to God, to write a prayer. And so I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then I'll give you further instructions. This morning, I am not going to be calling volunteers to come forward, but this is our giving moment. When we begin the next song, at any point during that song, we want to invite each of you forward, either to this side or right over there, to bring your offerings and to bring your prayer card. We'd like for you to put that in these wooden boxes. Our intention is to take all the prayer cards and these boxes and to bury them underneath the new Pathfinder sign that will be erected during next phase 3. Our prayers literally being a support to our reach in the community and to who we are, our identity. After you've placed your cards there, on either side of each of these boxes, there are containers that hold seed packets. And we'd like to invite each family to get one of these, and you'll receive further instruction on that in just a few minutes. So God bless your time of prayer and giving. Hey, live streamers, we would love for you to participate in this moment as well. And so if you would be willing to send your prayer along with your name and contact information, we'd be happy to mail you a seed packet. Just check out the text or the email below to find out how to contact us.